last night we were listening to the radio and we heard someone who called himself King Peter telling us to go and join the partisan. Mm. And we just spent 4 years of our lives fighting these people on his behalf.
Yeah.
How do I respond to my officers now, or to my soldiers now, who are asking, what do we do? Mm. What am I supposed to do? I just spent 4 years of my life fighting against these people on this guy's behalf, who's sitting comfortably in London, mind you. Mm. What do I do? Please advise.
So we just finished a really excellent interview with Stevan Bozanich, who is a doctoral candidate at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver.
I think we all enjoyed the conversation. It was very informative and fun for us. I would also say that he comes from a different perspective than ours usually is, which is probably quite obvious to our listeners. For example, if you listen to our episode on the Chetniks that we did, the difference is quite obvious even in the title, but still I think it was a good conversation and a valuable one to have, and I enjoyed it very much, as I said.
Yeah, absolutely. Whereas we're pretty comfortable saying that Chetniks were just, a bunch of morally reprehensible collaborationists. Stevan's a little more sensitive to the opacity of individual motivations in the movement. He's a proper historian, and I think this episode fills in a lot of gaps that we were unable to attend to in our previous Chetnik episode. So I think y'all are going to really like it. All right. Enjoy.
All right. So this is the Empire Never Ended podcast. I'm Fritz. We got Boris and Ray as usual, but not usual is our new friend Stevan here joining us in the compound to talk about Chetniks, something that he studies on purpose. Because he wants to.
Yeah, Stevan Bozanich on deck from Simon Fraser University in Vancouver, where he's working on his dissertation called Towards Collaboration, Chetnik Ideology, 1903 to 1946. Yeah. And, I guess, how did you get into studying Chetniks to begin with? And why should we study
Why'd
Chetniks?
you do that?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me on. It's a great pleasure to be here. So I actually met several years ago in Berlin. I met with John Paul Newman, who is a professor at Maynooth University in Dublin. And I wanted to work with him potentially for a master's degree or a PhD eventually. Things didn't work out, but life happened, and I'm now working with him. But anyway, in our conversation over it, he suggested, write what you know. And so I have a history of Serbian nationalist family I come from. Oh. And so my grandfather, my dada, was unofficially part of the Dinara division.
Wow.
He was actually in Knin. And repaired the guns and cannons and things like that for the Chetniks. And so a lot of it is family history that I'm looking at, for better and for worse. So
what do they think about your research?
So it's probably going to change after this, but I don't go into too much detail when I talk to them about what it is specifically that I do. I think they have kind of ideas, right? So yeah, I have quite a few family members that are quite deep in the sort of modern Chetnik movement. And so, yeah, things are kind of tense at times, right? Sure. You can imagine things is being a little kind of tense at times.
Well, listen, when my mom found out we started this podcast and she wanted to listen to it, I asked her, Mom, you can't really share this with your church friends, right? You're not going to like it. Like, thanks for paying attention, but you're really not going to like it. Yeah, I get it.
I love you and all, but yeah,
But
exactly.
yeah.
There are some things that, you might not get.
You have to draw the line. Yeah.
So you've been studying this topic for quite a long time then, I guess, at this point.
Yeah, so I mean, I in a lot of ways, it's I've been kind of studying it throughout my life in a way,
Sure.
Mhm.
because of that. You kind of grow up and you hear the stories about different things along the way, and then now, as I go through the secondary research and even some of the primary research, and I come across names of family members that I grew up with. I grew up with their grandsons or granddaughters or something, and there I am finding their deadas or something, in these
Wow.
registers.
Yeah.
So, in a lot of ways, I've been studying it all my life. But then, yeah, for my master's thesis, I did the sort of origins, I guess, of the Chetnik warrior, or sorry, of the Serbian warrior.
Mhm.
And from that, then really kind of stemmed this project. I wanted to get far more into the primary research side of things. My master's was far more literature based, looking at the oral epics and the sort of the way that they created warriors within the epics. Looking at like Vuk Karadzic's kind of oral the collections that he made in the 19th century. And then over time, just wanting to really get kind of deeper into the archives. Here I am.
Great.
So you mentioned the modern Chetnik movement, and so the Chetnik movement, even if we can call it like that, changed a lot through time. And I think today we'll mostly in this episode talk about the Ravna Gora movement of Draža Mihailović during the Second World War. But in your research, you really start in a way from the beginning, from the beginning of the 20th century and the start of the Chetnik movement in 1903. So maybe you can tell us in the beginning what the Chetnik movement was back then, who started it, for what purpose.
Yeah, so I think really it goes even further back than that. If we want to talk about it in terms of historical trajectories, because a lot of the sort of Chetovanya, right, the act of being a Chetnik, really goes back to being a Hajduk. And so, if we want to get geeky about it and really into kind of the literature on it, the great British historian Eric Hobsbawm wrote about the social bandits, right?
Yeah.
And so in his conceptualization, these people would, they're kind of like Robin Hoods, right? For Western audiences, I think would understand that probably better than if I dropped like some Hajduk name or something, Starina Novak or something.
Yeah.
But really, these people would kind of like quite literally steal from the rich and give to the poor. That was Hobsbawm's sort of idea. But then historians in the 20th century started to look at this and say, well, you know what, that wasn't actually the case. These people would steal from the rich and they'd sometimes give to the communities, but a lot of times they were keeping it for themselves and trying to make positions for themselves within these, most often the Ottoman Empire.
Yeah.
And trying to make a place for themselves. And so a lot of the sort of Chetnik history, I think, comes out of that. It kind of falls under the larger umbrella, I guess, of like irregular warfare or guerrilla warfare. And so part of what I'm trying to do is understand what is the difference then between like Hajdukovanie, like the act of being a Hajduk, and Chetovanie, what's the act of being a Chetnik. And really then for the Serbian example, the difference really comes in 1903. And this is where my study starts, basically. So in 1903, essentially what happens is there's a group of kind of what they call nationalist workers, these sort of nationally infused people who see what is happening in the region of Macedonia, which in the Ottoman Empire includes what we now know as North Macedonia, but also parts of Greece, what's now Greece, parts of Bulgaria, but also Kosovo. So that kind of general region of the Balkans. And they see what's happening there. And basically what's happening is they're seeing these people, the villagers and things, and Bulgaria is getting involved and Greece is getting involved. And of course, the Ottoman Empire has been there forever, it seems, like 500 or 600 years by this point. And the Serbs say, well, we need a piece of this pie. And so they term in the literature is the private enterprise, right? These private individuals start investing money and organizing these organizations and organizing people to literally go into the Macedonian province and try and do what Bulgaria has already been doing, what Greece has already been doing, and convert these people into becoming Serbs. So whether they're Serb, whether they're Macedonian, whether they're Bulgarian, whether they don't even care what they are, they have no conceptualization of what they are. They just want to farm their land or,
Sure.
be sheep herders even. And so Serbia then decides to get involved in this as the state. And so the state then really gets involved and kind of takes over this private enterprise and makes it modern. They give them arms, they bring in military officials, and the military literally organizes them into actual fighting groups. And you have these different organizations like the group that we all know as the Black Hand gets involved.
That was my next question. Like, could you like talk about a little bit about what is the connection of the Black Hand and the Chetniks? I mean, we usually, like us who lived through the 90s, when we discuss such things, are reminded of various paramilitary groups in the 90s that existed who were similar in the way they were also like in a way private groups, but heavily connected to state intelligence and so on. So there is some similarity in this connection with the Black Hand. So maybe you can talk about that.
Yeah, there really is a connection even in the 90s. And one of my friends and colleagues, Ivo Vukušić, who's at in the Netherlands, she's doing some really great work on this stuff, looking at the 90s and the state involvement there. But I see those parallels, from the 90s and then the Second World War and in 1903 even. And really what the Black Hand is a group of officers, junior officers, who decide to get together and they create this kind of clandestine organization. And it operates alongside of the military and it operates alongside of the government. And it's really these guys, this core group of maybe a dozen people at most, who kind of get involved. And then from there, they kind of spread the word, and it spreads all throughout the Slavic lands until eventually, you get to like 1914, and like everybody pretty much, who can speak the language is part of the Black Hand unofficially, right?
Yeah,
right.
But really, in 1903, they're kind of just starting to get involved. And it's really under the Petar Karađorđević that things get going. So the guys who kind of start the Black Hand, they go and they assassinate the Obrenović dynasty, right? And that's really like when they start to get involved. And they start then, they're the ones who kind of really organized the Chetniks then in the early part of the 20th century.
Yeah, that's interesting because today when people talk about Chetniks, usually they are somehow synonymous with the monarchist idea. But in this early stage, we see that a lot of these Black Hand people are actually inspired by Republican movements like the 19th century Italian nationalist movement and figures like Garibaldi and so on. They are, of course, very nationalist, but not necessarily monarchist. I mean, there are people who have the reputation of killing kings, so it's not very monarchist thing to do. and these are the people who, in a way, as you said, start the Chetnik movement. So it's a very
And I mean, there is actually quite a large leftist trend as well. Even within the Black Hand, you have a guy like Gacinovic, for example, who gets involved in the Black Hand and then is of course involved in the assassination in 1914. But this guy was called by one of his contemporaries a Bakunist, who is like the quintessential anarchist. And so you have these leftist tendencies as well within the early, and even up until at least the Second World War. You have guys there who, I don't know if I'll be jumping ahead here too much in the questions, but like Dragiša Vasić, for example.
I had a question about him as well.
Yeah, he goes to the Soviet Union, and is accused of being a communist. And then, Second World War comes and he's fighting with this group that are supposedly the royalists.
Yeah. I have a whole question about that, yeah. But I feel that like these terms, anarchists and Bakuninists were kind of used very loosely at the time.
Sure.
And I think that a lot of like South Slavic people in the late 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, who saw themselves as followers of Bakunin, kind of mixed up his pan-Slavic phase with the anarchist phase. So it had kind of very strange results, I would say. I think there is a lot of that in young Bosnia as well. And also like Black Hand, for example, the most prominent like Serbian anarchist of the time was a guy called Krsta Cicvaric, and he at the time when Black Hand showed up, kind of started slowly to convert into a nationalist. And he started writing for their like newspaper, the Piemont. And so he was like the most prominent anarchist of the time, but yeah, changed and ended up as a collaborationist and was shot by the partisans after the end of the Second World War. So yeah, a lot of strange things there. I don't know, maybe just before we start talking about the post First World War period, maybe, I don't know, can you comment anything or say anything about what is the relationship with the VMRO, or the Internal Macedonian Revolutionary Organization, who is very active at the time in the region of Macedonia? It seems they were also at times called Chetniks, and to me it seems that they were maybe even in a way an inspiration for Serbian Chetniks in some part. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, so a lot of the sort of old Chetniks, they actually fought in Imro to begin with. And then my understanding of it, I haven't delved too far into it, but the way that I understand it, at least, is after the Ilindun uprising fails, the Serbs and the Bulgarians kind of get together to try and figure out what happened, where do we go from here? And the Serbs want to take a bigger role in things. And they say, you know what, this clearly isn't working. You're trying to convert these people into being Bulgarian. We're speaking Bulgarian. There are clearly people here who understand Serbian and speak Serbian, and we want to have more of a say in this. And of course, the Serbian historiography says, like, the Bulgarians basically said no and shut them down. And then the group splits into two at this point, where you have the Serbian faction and a Bulgarian faction. And so, then you start to see a lot of the similar sort of symbiology coming out, right? The Serbs start using the skull and crossbones, for example, and the gun and the knife symbol. And their slogan is unity or death, right? And things like that, which are all kind of taken from Imro. I use Imro just to keep it simple, the Internal Macedonian Revolutionary Organization. But
that's probably the right way to do it.
A dozen names. Exactly. And so I mean, you sort of have those parallels, but to be sure, I mean, like, they weren't the only groups using those kind of symbols, right? I mean, like we could point to pirates, for example. Like even Somali pirates today, I think, still use the skull and crossbones symbol.
It's the coolest symbol.
It is pretty badass, yeah. I mean, the Makhnovists in Ukraine also used it. Yeah.
Exactly, right? So, it makes sense, right? So it's kind of hard to say what is influenced directly, for example, from Imro, and what is part of this kind of trend at about the same time amongst all these different groups that maybe have some sort of similarity. Maybe they've all read a little bit of kind of anarchist works, but then they're also influenced by people like Mazzini, for example, and stuff like that. So I think to kind of go back to your point, Ray, is like, I think around this time, and certainly at least into the interwar period, like the 1920s and 1930s, you have a whole group of people trying to figure out what it is that they think, right? What is it that I believe? And so they're pulling on these ideas from, like Bakunin, for example, and, Mazzini, and they're pulling on ideas then later from Mussolini. And, so they're trying to kind of bring these ideas together. And you really see that come out then in the kind of fascist movement, out of Italy, where the roots are in socialism, but really it's so far removed because it's influenced by all of these other elements. And so I think in a lot of ways, then that's kind of what's happening also with the Serbian Chetniks, as well as the Macedonian, so on and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, even I don't know if you saw this detail, but yeah, talking about these connections with fascism and being a kind of a proto-fascist group, they even had like I found in some research that even very early on, like I think 1906 or 1907, Chetniks were known for having clashes with like organized workers in Serbia and terrorizing them. Because I read about like there was a workers' protest, a big one in Belgrade in 1906 or 7. And after that, when workers started dispersing, they went to like a kafana and they saw a few Chetniks there sitting like in a bar. And one of them was actually Kosta Pechanac himself, who will have a prominent role. And then they like basically decided to lynch those Chetniks and surrounded the kafana, not allowing Chetniks to leave. So the gendarmerie was like called, and there was like shooting in the streets, and some people got killed and so on. And the explanation why this happened was that this was like a response of the workers to the terror they were submitted to by Chetniks on a daily basis. So and I was very like surprised when I found that. It's usually not discussed this moment in the early history.
So they were essentially being used as strike breakers,
Yeah.
right? And at that point in time.
Yeah, I don't know about that exact example, but I mean, from my minimal experience in Belgrade, that just sounds like a regular night in the kafana.
Well, yeah.
Bunch of Chetniks, some fighting.
You're right.
All right.
It's every family meeting I've ever had. But I mean, I'm not surprised, right? Because you have even into the 1920s and 1930s, like for example, like Momcilo Đujić in Dalmatia, he gets accused by some people of being a strikebreaker. And he's another one who supposedly has these leftist links. He's under investigation by the royal government of being a communist. And yet here he is supposedly under the pay of Italy and being paid to kind of break these strikes and do these things. So I really wouldn't be surprised if there is a link there, because like Đujić also has this tie then to the old Chetnik group. So there is this kind of tradition.
Yeah, maybe let's move to the 20s and 30s, which is like a different now situation. Historically, Yugoslavia exists, and Chetniks become sort of like a extremely nationalist militarist association of veterans, right? So what is their role in the 20s and 30s in Yugoslavia?
Yeah, it's kind of an interesting case, I think. And this is actually where John Paul Newman kind of comes in, because he had his book, Yugoslavia in the Shadow of War, that really talks about this, as well, like not just the Chetniks, but this kind of 1920s and 1930s in the kingdom of Serbs, Croats, Slovenes, later of course Yugoslavia, and he looks at all these different groups. But the role of the Chetniks is actually kind of interesting, because in a lot of ways they see themselves as the sort of vanguard of protecting this First World War and Balkan War tradition of, we fought for our Southern Slav people. The majority of them were Serbs. And so the Serbs then are the center of this fighting tradition, where, the Croats and Muslims and Slovenes and all the other Southern Slavs, or people that we can call Southern Slavs, fought for the enemy who lost, right? Yeah. And so they really see themselves as the ones who not only freed these territories, but also liberated and joined them, right? So they have this sort of maybe not misplaced, but certainly grand perceptions of themselves. And so they think that they deserve this central role in the state. And the state kind of says, thanks for your work, let's move on. Basically. And so the Chetniks then kind of operate kind of like a modern veterans organization, where there's the social movement of trying to fight for their rights, trying to get pensions and things like that, protections for invalids, as they called them, people who got hurt during the war, but also really kind of pissed off that they're not being recognized. And I think a lot of this anger then literally turns violent. And so they start targeting mostly ethnic minorities and people, even Serbs, though, who don't necessarily agree with this extreme nationalist bent that they have. And so they start targeting these minorities and holding strikes and going on marches in places like Sarajevo, for example, or like even in Zagreb, right? Like they caused like a whole storm in the 1930s, where like a riot breaks out and they're fighting and, the whole thing. And it's almost like a civil war that breaks out, like a mini civil war. And so in a lot of ways, then there's this tension between these veteran groups, these various Chetnik organizations and the state. But then at the same time, the state is kind of using this tension to kind of keep control then of ethnic Croats and ethnic Muslims or religiously Muslims, but these groups who may not identify as either Serbian or as Orthodox. So the state really kind of uses this and harnesses this tension for its own purposes. So I haven't seen evidence of it necessarily, but there is. The evidence does kind of imply, let's say, that the state actually does use these people on a direct level. Actually, hey, you need to go into these areas and kind of control these people. And certainly that happens in southern Serbia, in old Serbia, in Macedonia, and in Kosovo, but also in other places as well. So it's this kind of tense situation between these veteran organizations and the state, and it's really then these Chetnik groups that kind of raise the stakes, right? They're putting ethnicity at the middle of, like right in the middle of these conversations. It's not just about veteran rights; it's about Serb veteran rights.
Yeah,
it's not about a question of religion; it's about the Orthodox religion.
Yeah,
and so if you're not fighting for Serbian rights or you're not fighting for Orthodox rights, then you must be a Croat or you must be a Muslim or Slovene or anyone else, right?
Yeah. But it's interesting that at the same time there is this development of this ideology of so-called integral Yugoslavism. So at the same time there is a push from the state to create a Yugoslav nation, and Chetniks are also involved in that. So I think, and I'm not sure if I'm right, but there is a kind of a division between Chetnik associations. Some are like completely in line with Serbian nationalism, and others accept this Yugoslav nationalism. And even you have like at the time you have Croat Chetnik supporters or even ideologues in this proto-fascist group called Orjuna, which has a close tie with one of the Chetnik associations, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So that's the sort of one other kind of divide, I guess, or one strand of divides that emerges is this division then between the sort of extreme Serb nationalists and the extreme, I guess you could say, Yugoslav nationalists. And really the sort of extreme Serb nationalists, it's kind of like a spectrum, I guess. You have the one sort of wing, I guess you could say, who really want to have separate Serbs and Croats and Slovenes within the state, and very specific and carved out kind of territories. This area is Serb, this area is Croat, this area, so on and so forth. But then you also have, as you say, the sort of integral Yugoslavs, where your Serbian or Croat identity kind of gets couched within this overall Yugoslav one. So you could still be a Slovene, but first you need to be a Yugoslav. And so again, it's all about tension in this period, right? It's this tension then between the state and ethnic identity. What state do you belong to? But then what ethnic identity or even national identity do you belong to? And so this split then happens amongst the Chetniks, where you have the people who argue that we're Yugoslavs, but we're also Serbs, and then you have the other group then that have we're Serbs only. Yugoslavia is just this construct that was created out of these people who historically have never been together, and we shouldn't be together. But if we are going to be a state, then we need to be within our own kind of pockets. And so I mean the Yugoslav branch kind of has a closer tie to the state in that regard, certainly under the King Alexander's dictatorship, 1929 and 1934, where that idea really kind of gets created. And so they sort of start to develop closer ties. And then you have the Serb nationalists then, who kind of are very much at a distance from the state, and try to kind of keep things separate, and they're the ones who really argue for this kind of greater Serb idea as well within the state.
So would you say that the Chetniks at the time were kind of a proto-fascist movement, or how would you define their relationship with fascism?
Yeah, I think that's something I'm struggling with. I kind of object to people, like on social media, for example, calling the Chetniks fascists. And the reason for that is because, at least if you look at the Second World War, there was such a break between the Chetniks of Draža Mihailović and Dimitrij Ljotić, the arguably like fascist in Yugoslavia. They simply did not get along, at least not Draža's camp anyway. And so I think again it's comes down to those kind of trajectories where people are still trying to figure things out, right? You have to remember that fascism really only gets created in 1922, which is at about the same time that these Chetnik organizations start to be created as veterans organizations. And so it's this sort of experimentation between, what are we? Are we communist? Well, no, we don't agree with that, so we're going to reject that. But we will adopt these sort of ideas. Are we fascist? Well, no, we're not, but we'll accept these sort of ideas. And so I think, to kind of paint a broad brush is difficult in that regard. Because I think certainly, if we look at the actions of a group like Oriuna in the interwar period, they definitely seem like a fascistic group. If you compare them, say, for example, to like the brown shirts, they're doing a lot of the same things. They're marching, they're breaking skulls, they're making divisions between ethnic groups or even social groups and classes and things like that. But they're not explicitly fascist. They're not, adopting the same kind of salutes, and they're not, even tying themselves to Mussolini in the same way as some of these other fascist groups are, at about the same time.
The Oriuna seems to be inspired by Italian fascism, but it opposes its goals because these two nationalisms conflict on those. But it seems that also, I think, it includes some of the people who we know were kind of inspired by Italy and later were collaborated with the Italian occupiers, like Vojvoda Jevđević, for example, or Ilija Trifunović Birčanin, who were important members of Oriuna, I think, and later kind of were known to be very pro-Italian, I would say, and pro-fascist in that sense.
Yes, that I would agree with, and certainly I think collaboration during the war comes out of that. I think a lot of it too is local circumstances. And so in my dissertation, what I do is I look at three groups. I look at Draža's group, which is in like kind of Bosnia and Serbia. I look at Đurišić's group in Montenegro, and I look at Đujić's group in Dalmatia and kind of Western Bosnia. And the reason why I do that is because I think in order to kind of understand the Chetniks of that time, you have to look at them within their sort of internal context. What's happening in Dalmatia. And so, for example, like with Birčanin, he's off in like Macedonia still. During the interwar period, he's in Macedonia and he's in Bosnia, and nowhere near. Well, I mean, relatively speaking, he's nowhere near Dalmatia. So he doesn't have the same kind of concerns over territory as the Dalmatian Serbs do. Because Italy, of course, has designs on places like Trieste.
Right.
And they have designs on Rijeka and the coast in Dalmatia and stuff like that. So I think that's far more of a concern for the people, say, for example, in Dalmatia than it is for someone in like Bosnia.
Right.
Okay. So we started talking about the Second World War now, which is kind of the main topic. So we talked about the pre-First World War period of Chetniks, when they were this paramilitary organized by the state to fight against the Ottoman rule in Macedonia mostly. Then we talked about the second phase after the end of the war, when the monarchist Yugoslavia exists, and Chetniks are mainly veteran associations, extremely nationalist and militarist, connected to different political parties. We didn't get so much into that, but maybe we can also mention it. And then, so the third phase would be the start of the Second World War, when it's a part of the Chetniks are organized as a resistance movement in the beginning, and some other part from the start are openly a collaborationist formation, in Serbia at least.
Yeah, so I mean, if we want to make the connection then from, say, for example, 1903 up until 1941, the real kind of figure, I guess, that kind of looms large is, and you mentioned him already, is Costa Pechanac. And the reason for that is because by 1941, he's really the kind of main Chetnik guy. You know, he led an uprising in 1917 against the Bulgarians, and it, for all intents and purposes, it goes horribly. It fails and it gets crushed like really quickly. And Bulgaria then starts to enact reprisals against the population and like kills entire villages. So the exact opposite of what it was that he was trying to accomplish. But he's able to take that kind of story and build this myth around himself. And this is how he takes over the kind of interwar Chetnik Association. And
victory and defeat is what you call it.
Exactly. And so, like, you know, the common thread in Serb history, right? It's victory through defeat. You know, you look at Tsar Lazar all the way up until, you know, Gavrilo Princip, and, you know, how you could say, like, Mladic, for example, you know, he got caught, but, you know, really he's winning in some way. So, yeah.
Or
so,
Draža Mihailovic in the end, yeah.
Exactly. You know, you make a martyr out of him in a way, right? And suddenly, you know, you have statues of him up in Libertyville, Illinois, or, you know, you have, you know, the Chetnik movement in Hamilton, Ontario or something. So, yeah, exactly. And so, yeah, so I mean, Costa Pechanac then really represents this kind of most popular Chetnik, right, by 1941. Everyone kind of knows him. He builds up this cult of personality around himself. And has this tradition going all the way back to, you know, I think 1905 is when he becomes a voivoda, if I'm not mistaken. And so, you know, he has this long tradition of being a Chetnik and goes on. I think he tries to resist in the first couple weeks and realizes, like, you know, this is futile. And, you know, he's old by then too, not to kind of excuse things, but, you know, at some point you just have to go, you know what, my back hurts. I'm tired all the time. You know, just I give up. So, you know, not like I'm not trying to like make light of it or, you know, you certainly not excuse it. But at the same time, you know, you kind of understand where he's coming from. And so he openly collaborates. But then at the same time, or, you know, at about the same time, then you have these group of officers who decide, you know what, our army got completely crushed. Our government has left the country. We have to take up the call now and defend the country because there's literally nobody left, right? The one person that we relied on, Costa Pechanac, is now a collaborator. So what are we going to do? And so you have these group of officers who, you know, eventually emerges, the leader is Draža Mihailovic, simply because he's the highest ranking at the time. And, you know, people then kind of hear about this and kind of come to him, and even, you know, higher ranking officers who arrive at his camp in Ravna Gora say, you know what, you're leading this. I'm the higher ranking officer, but, you know, our army got defeated and you're the only one who seems to know what's going on and how to do this. So we're going to follow you. So, and then, you know, out of that, then you kind of have what we call the Chetniks emerge. Now, something
although Draža was not connected to the old Chetnik movement.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So he had no history at all in the Chetnik movement. He's a professional officer. He, you know, very much is trained in this tradition of, you know, Clausewitz and, you know, Germany and stuff like that. And so he's an officer. He gets paid. He's, you know, expected to kind of carry himself in a particular way. You know, he's clean shaven, for example, you know, like even. So, you know, he has no connection at all whatsoever. His only kind of run-in, so he fought in the First World War. And of course, you know, Serbia again gets completely decimated. The military gets decimated in 1915 and eventually retreats to Salonika. But along with that, you have, you know, the same Chetniks, the old Chetniks, alongside him. And so I don't have documentary evidence of this, but you have to figure that you have officers and regular soldiers alongside these paramilitary Chetnik, alongside this whole group of refugees and politicians. And it's this kind of chaos, right? And everyone's trying to get through to Corfu first and then Salonika, and trying to figure out, like, you know, how do we then rebuild our state, you know, in 1915, and how do we get it back? How do we fight back? And so you have this kind of mix then of people. So this is really his only kind of major run-in, I guess, with Chetnik of the old style. Now, in the interwar period, Yugoslavia creates these, they write these two pamphlets on how to conduct Chetnik warfare. And so they start to implement it. And at the center of this is supposed to be Costa Pachana. And after like having it as doctrine for like a year or two, the government takes it away, or the military takes that pamphlet off the table and says, you know what, we're scrapping it. We don't need Chetnici. We're just going to be a regular army. But Draža, I think, kind of kept this in mind, and he writes his own pamphlet as a suggestion to the government and to the military, and says, you know what, we need to have a Chetnik organization as part of our defense plans. And so it kind of charts, you know, how do we do this and what does it look like and that sort of thing.
This is before the occupation or after the occupation?
This is before. This is, I think, if I remember correctly, I think it was in the 1930s that he wrote this. And so he comes up with this document. And one of the main things besides, like, you know, Chetovanje that he comes up with is dividing the army into camps. So he has an ethnic Slovenian division, he has an ethnic Croat division, and he has an ethnic Serb division, and says, we're going to divide our Chetniks up into 3 divisions, and they're going to be led by Slovenes, one by a Croat and one by a Serb, and they're going to be populated by the Slovenes in the Slovenian camp, Croats in the Croat camp, and Serbs in the Serbian camp. And that's how we're going to conduct our Chetnik warfare. Well, the Ministry of Defense doesn't like that idea and punishes him by, like, I think it was 2 weeks under house arrest for coming up with this idea. So he gets punished for coming up with this idea. But it's an idea that sticks with him throughout. And so by 1941, he has this conceptualization of Chetovanje, right? He came into contact with these people in 1915. He was trained in it, at least to some extent, by the government, by the military. And he wrote this pamphlet about Chetovanje from his own kind of doctrine. And so by 1941, then he has this idea of how to conduct guerrilla warfare. Whether it's any good is another question, but, you know, he at least has some concept of what it is and how to go about conducting it. So he doesn't have the connections to the Chetnik organizations and associations from the interwar period, but he certainly does have ideas of what it looks like and what it should be in times of war. And it's precisely in that, you know, what happens if we're invaded? How do we conduct guerrilla warfare? And so he's basically implementing his ideas from the interwar period. So that's really his only kind of connection, I guess, to guerrilla warfare, to Chetovanje, right?
Yeah, but on the other hand, the situation is complicated inside of his resistance movement as well, because outside of Serbia, in Bosnia and Croatia, where the Serbian population is really under the heavy repression of the Ustasha state, there is almost like a spontaneous uprising, not so ideological, just against this terror of the Ustashas, and then it divides into 2 parts, one which also wants to fight against the occupiers, which evolves into partisans, and the others that want just to fight against the Ustashas, which become the Chetniks outside of Serbia movement, who they become loyal to Draža Mihailović, especially after he is recognized by the exiled state as the commander of the Yugoslav army in Fatherland, which is the official name of his army. But the leaders of those Chetniks are more connected to the old Chetnik movement, right? And are also much more open about their collaboration early on, which is kind of something that Draža doesn't like, the openness of it.
That's right. Yeah. So in my dissertation, what I do is I'm looking, like I said, at the 3 groups, and so I kind of see it in a way as a spectrum. I kind of conceptualize it to kind of break it down into simplest terms. I see it as a spectrum. So on one extreme, you have Draža's group, which are basically a core of officers, right? Military trained, they're professional. And, you know, like I said, they conduct themselves or are expected to conduct themselves in particular ways and fight warfare in a particular way. The second group I look at then is in Montenegro of Pavle Đurišić, and he's a professional officer as well by 1941. He has amongst himself a group of officers as well. But the situation in Montenegro is kind of tricky, and so he ends up taking on a lot of these kind of unprofessional soldiers, let's say. They're not paid by the state. They don't have military training per se. They're far closer to guerrilla warfare and irregular warfare than what Draža's group is. And then the third group then that I look at is in Dalmatia with Monšlo Đujić, where they basically have no military training at all. They're, Đujić, for example, was a priest. They're made up of teachers and other priests and clergy and, sort of village elders and stuff like that. So they're very much, kind of unorganized and kind of ragtag and trying to fight for their lives against the NDH and this genocide that the Ustaša are committing against them. So, you kind of have on one end, you have Draža, who's very professional. And then on the other hand, then you have Đujić, who's very much
completely nuts.
Well, I got to be careful about what I say because I'm actually related to him. So I have family that I need to consider. So your words, not mine. But yeah, I mean, certainly not a professional soldier, right? He's a priest. He's a village leader. He's not. Thinking about, reprisals necessarily against his own people per se, in the same way that Draža is, But at the same time, then he also has this history from 1934 of being part of the Chetnik Association. And so he came under the umbrella then of Costa Pečanac in 1934, who actually kind of inaugurates him as a Chetnik and brings the sort of Chetnik organization and Chetnik traditions to Dalmatia. So Dalmatia has this history then of Haiduks, Haiduci, of, further north of Uskoci, the Uskoks, who are kind of like pirates, I guess you could say. They're like Haiduks, but on the sea, seafaring Haiduks. So, far more this kind of tradition then of irregular warfare. And so this then is the tradition that Đujić comes out of, right? So he has, he has a little bit of the training from Pečanac and his men. He kind of has an understanding of guerrilla warfare, but not, he isn't a Hajduk. He isn't a Chetnik who has, actual fighting experience from, 1903 or something like that. So it's this kind of, again, kind of like a gray area where he's still a civilian, but still has this kind of, he dabbles, I guess you could say, in kind of guerrilla warfare.
Yeah. And although these Chetnik formations in Croatia and Bosnia, their whole reason for existence is they want only to fight against Ustašas. They early on make deals with Ustašas, right? So I don't know. Can you talk about these deals of the Chetniks with Ustašas?
So really, the first deals, at least in Dalmatia, that come about are actually with the Italians. And one study I read actually suggests that guys like Birčanin and Đujić and Jevđević and some of these other ones were actually Italian spies. I'm not sure whether I necessarily buy into that, or I think it's kind of overstated. Calling them spies is a little too far. There certainly were relationships, but I think calling them spies is going a little too far. And so the first deals that come about really are with Italy, and the deals that they cut are basically on the go. So the Serbs kind of flee this terror from the Ustaša and arrive in the Italian occupied territory. And the Italians go, well, what the hell do we do? Suddenly we have like all these refugees and all these people, and we don't know what to do. We're going to put them into camps. And so they put them in refugee camps, even though some of them are refugees, some of them are officers, right, from the military, from the Yugoslav army. Some of them are, again, like Chetniks, from the interwar period. So it's kind of like this, again, it's this mix of people. But it's out of this then that the sort of Dinara division comes about.
Okay.
Whereas I think in Bosna, now, okay, let me kind of put in a caveat here, right? I don't study Bosna in the same way as like Marco Huar did in his books, right? For example, he's got collaboration and resistance in Hitler's Bosnia, I think it is, or something like that. And so really then where the deals with the Ustasha come about in that regard is a little bit later to my understanding than it does with the Italian. And the reason for that is because the Ustasha realize, you know what we're doing, the kind of way that we're terrorizing the Serb population isn't working out. You know, they kind of see that, for one, they don't even really have like a clear ideology. They don't really know who is a Croat. You know, do we include Muslims in this kind of thing? And eventually they say, you know, well, the Muslims are the purest of all Croats.
Right.
So we welcome them in, you know, even within like Hitler's kind of conception, you know, Croats aren't Aryan, they're Slavs. And so Hitler has to make a special exception and call them honorary Aryans, you know,
Honorary
in the same
Aryans.
way he does for the Japanese and stuff. So, you know, they're kind of this mixture then again of ideologies, and kind of unclear even in their own right as to what it is that they're trying to do. And so, you know, out of this, then they kind of see that things aren't working. And so it's kind of the relationship, I guess, between the Serbs there and the Ustasha kind of makes sense in this way. Because the Ustasha see that what they're doing isn't working. The Serbs see that, you know what, if we don't do something, kind of come to understandings, we're going to get completely obliterated. And so we have to kind of, you know, talk with the Ustasha and figure out, you know, how to kind of solve this. And so one thing that kind of emerges out of this then is the Croatian Orthodox Church, which gets created, right? And so it's kind of their way of saying, you know what, we'll allow Serbs, but you have to be Croatian, right? So you could still be Orthodox, but you have to call yourself Croatian.
And apparently some Chetnik leaders recognized the church and sent some delegations to it or something like this.
I believe so, yeah. So, I mean, again, like I'm not entirely clear on that, you know, the kind of exact relationship to that, but there certainly was at least this understanding that, you know, we're going to let this exist because it makes sense. Like we have bigger fish to fry at the moment. You know, we have people who are getting killed basically arbitrarily. So you know what, if we have this kind of concession, we'll allow it. Besides actually, you know, possibly believing in it. So.
Right. And I mean, we talked about in our episodes about Ustashas, about this kind of chaos and their, you know, overly ambitious plan to exterminate the Serbs. But what that also led to was these reprisal massacres perpetrated by the Chetniks, right? And particularly in Bosnia, like in Foča and 43 and the like. Who was engaging in these massacres? Was that more of the Đujić company, or, you know, how does that translate command-wise?
Yeah, so again, that's kind of one of those hazy answers, right? There is no black and white answer to this. And so, you know, as a historian, this is kind of what we try to do, right? Is kind of put these puzzles together. There wasn't, I wish that it existed. Of course, then, you know, my dissertation wouldn't be happening right now, because I'm sure someone else would have figured it out. But there isn't a document that says, you know, step 1, kill all the Croats. Step 2, kill all the Muslims. You know, so in some way, it would be so much easier if it did exist. But basically, what happens is Draža Mihailović makes Pavle Đurišić commander. And they create the Lim Sanjak Chetnik division. And so what happens then is Đurišić in Montenegro, he like I said, he has these group of guys around him. And in 1943 goes into places like Foča and Chetnice, and, you know, some of these other places in kind of southern Bosnia, and kind of on the border between Bosnia and Herzegovina and Montenegro and kind of southern Serbia. And completely takes out villages of Muslims. I think in the one report, he reports something like I'm trying to remember the exact number now off the top of my head, but thousands of civilians basically are killed, as well as these soldiers, right? And so this happens from like February 1943, I think, until April. Just thousands and thousands of Muslims being killed in Montenegro. And so in Montenegro, then it's far more a kind of initiative. They don't have to put up with the communists in the same way as like Draža does in Serbia. He doesn't have to put up with the Ustasha in the same way as Đurić does in Dalmatia. And so he kind of has free reign to what he can do. And so he kind of takes this opportunity then to target people that he doesn't want in his new territory and goes after Muslims, basically. So that is a far more kind of self-motivated initiative, right? He plans it and kind of goes after it. One of the documents that I use to kind of show this kind of line of kind of command is in December 1941. Draža Mihailović issued a document to Pavle Đurišić in which he says, basically, we need to solve the Muslim question, right? We have to figure out what it is that we're going to do with them, and we're going to create a continuous territory between Montenegro and Serbia. And in order to do that, we have to get rid of the Muslims who live in that territory that's preventing the unification of Montenegro and Serbia. And so the culmination then of this is in 1943, the massacre of thousands of Muslims. Now, in Dalmatia, on the other hand, they kind of start off as, they're being targeted. They're threatened by the Ustasha directly. So not only then do they have to fight for their lives in this regard, but there's also a strong communist element there, which doesn't exist in Montenegro. So they kind of feel threatened from all sides, right? Plus you have the Italians who accept them and support them, but at the same time are occupying their territory, right? So there's, again, this kind of tension between the groups. And so what happens then for the Chetniks in Dalmatia is they're very much focused on kind of gaining the upper hand first. And so what they do then is they use the help and support of Italy, who's interested in creating this divide amongst the Ustasha, because Italy wants more territory in Dalmatia, right? So they want to push the Ustasha back as far as possible, even though they're supposed to be allies. They want more territory. And so use this sort of Serb element, as they say, to kind of create this divide then between the Ustasha and their program and the Serbs and their program, so that Italy can kind of get what they want. But the Serbs, meanwhile, are using Ustasha and the Italians and this kind of tension that's existing there to kind of get what they want. So it's this kind of, I guess, triangle, right? You can think of it in those terms of people kind of, leveraging one side over the other to kind of get what they want. Until finally, at some point, the Chetniks don't quite get the upper hand on the communists. They eventually cut deals in Dalmatia with the Ustasha to kind of, stop killing us and we won't fight you. But then what the Chetniks then do is they then go and enact reprisals then against villages that they see as having threatened them previously for the Ustasha massacres. And so in Dalmatia, whereas like in Montenegro, you have, it's very much like a one-man initiative in a way. In Dalmatia, it kind of comes out of this desire to kind of get revenge, right? So this is why I say, you kind of have to look at the context within the territory, right? Montenegro has its own kind of context. Dalmatia has its own context. And out of that, then you get very different reasons and very different ways of killing as well, Like in Montenegro, for example, they're kind of, just going at it. They're really just targeting these villages and, literally dividing people up. Are you, what faith do you believe in? And okay, you're over here, you're over there, and, wipe them out, burning villages, in whole and blocking roads so that people can't escape, and, stuff like that. Whereas in Dalmatia, it's very targeted. It's specific, this village attacked us or, came after us, or we know, or at least we think we know that there are a lot of Ustasha in this village, or that came from this village. So we're going to go after their families. So it's targeted specific versus targeted kind of general.
Right.
If that makes sense.
Yeah.
So these complicated relations also produced the fact that some of these Chetnik formations had like double or even triple identities. So the Dinara division is a part of the Draža's Yugoslav army, but at the same time it exists as a part of the Italian occupying fascist system as a volunteer anti-communist militia. And even more kind of drastic example is Juricic's Chetniks, who towards the end of the war, besides being a part of Draža's Yugoslav army, become also a part of the Serbian Volunteer Corps of Ljotic, at least formally, which is like a Serbian fascist collaborationist army. And even more bizarrely, under Sekula Drljevic as a Montenegrin national army, they become even a part, officially at least, of the Ustasha regime. So they have like a triple identity at the same time.
Yeah, that's a good observation. Yeah, I think again, part of it comes out of that sort of chaos, of what the war created. And if we want to link it to the sort of earlier periods, what is it that we stand for? Are the kind of questions too. They're constantly asking. I really object to the fact that a lot of people kind of essentialize these groups and these people, and say that paint them all with broad brushes. The Chetniks are fascist, or the Chetniks are all collaborators, or the Chetniks were all freedom fighters, even. Because there wasn't any of that. It was all of that, and yet it was none of that at all. So I think, as you say, these multiple kind of identities and multiple allegiances existed, and they contradict one another. How can I be a resistance movement if I'm collaborating? But how can I be a collaborator if I'm still openly resisting? Right? Like, how do you define what a collaborator is, or what a resistor is at that point? It renders all of these terms completely meaningless. And so you have, like you say with Juricic, where he fights alongside the communists in 1941, and the partisans, or what would become the partisans, he fights alongside them against the Italians, but then ends up cutting a deal with the Italians to fight the partisans, right? But then becomes part of Draža's group, but then says to the Italians, "I'm not part of Draža's group." Right? So he's playing all of these sides off of one another in some ways, while at the same time actually adhering to every single one of them at the same time. So he's very much kind of in it for himself, I think, in that regard. Now, you mentioned about his role in the volunteer army, Ljotic's army. So that, I think, is one of those contextual kind of events where so he gets Juricic gets arrested in 1943 and captured by the Nazis. Right? They capture him after the operation on the Neretva. Right, the famous story and famous movie with Orson Welles. Right? And he gets captured and sent off to a concentration camp somewhere in, I think it was Slovakia, if I'm not mistaken, and eventually escapes, and then gets captured again and brought to Belgrade, and then cuts a deal then with the German ambassador, German representative there, and so we don't know exactly what happened. All that we have is the brief kind of mention of Juricic in the German representative's diaries, or his memoirs, I should say, where he writes about meeting Juricic, kind of describes what he looks like, because that matters, I guess. No details about the actual meeting, just he was a nice looking fellow.
What was he wearing?
Exactly. Yeah.
Who was
nothing but a smile?
That kind of meeting.
Right. So we don't know exactly what happened, but we do know the result, and the result is Juricic is let out. He's freed, and he ends up leading this volunteer army that falls under Dimitrije Ljotic's and Milan Nedic's kind of wing, and so through that becomes an open German collaborator. Up until that point, he doesn't collaborate with the Germans, or if he does, it's not formalized, right? It's not in writing. It's not anything official. His collaboration is with Italy, not so much with Germany, until 1943.
Which Italy leaves the picture then anyway, right? So
exactly in September.
Yeah.
Italy's gone by September 1943. So again, it's the context, right? He's been captured. He's trying to save himself, but at the same time, he wants to keep what he had, right? He wants to be able to have the arms coming and the food and the power as well, right? We can't overlook that factor, the power. And so as you say, Boris, there the Italy's gone, and so Germany steps in and takes over this area, and so he's going to cut a deal with the Germans, and that's what he does, and creates this, or becomes one of the leaders at least of this volunteer militia. And so again, right, he's an Italian collaborator. Now he's a German collaborator. He effectively disavows Mihailovich to the Germans. Right, I don't support him. I'm not anything to do with him. But then in 1944, goes and meets up with Draža, and they're all together. 1944, 1945. Alongside one another, trying to figure out what do we do.
Well, because when he cuts a deal right later with the Ustasha and this Montenegrin National Army, but still gets killed by the Ustasha in the end because Drljević stabs him in the back. It's a really messy story. I mean,
it really is. And I mean, there is that kind of. I mean, again, we don't know the complete story about what happened and whether Drljević actually kind of sold him down the river, as they say. That's the theory. As far as I know, I think that's the theory that the kind of Chetniks understand. The sort of Chetnik supporters. But there is, to my understanding, there is truth to it. And I'm saying this strictly as not as a historian, but someone who has ties to Serb nationalists and who has heard the stories. And the old guys sitting around at the Serb Center in Windsor, Ontario, talking about it. So there's a plug. If you're ever in Windsor, Ontario, go to the Serbian Center on Tecumseh Road East and say hi to my brothers for me. And so, so I mean,
just hi though. Listeners.
Yes, just hi, nothing else. Yeah. Stevan says hi. So I mean, I kind of, as this kind of, even for myself, I have, it kind of feels like I have these multiple identities going on. I have the historian who's trying to look at these things objectively. I have the family history that I can't get rid of even if I wanted to. I have these kind of personal ties and these personal stories that I can't really use in my professional kind of umbrella, because I've heard these stories and I can't cite, Chica Simo, 1998.
Stevan, I mean, you don't have to cite shit here, man. Tell away.
Fair enough. So I mean, I have to kind of be careful with how I approach these things professionally as well as personally. Yeah.
Maybe now towards the end we can talk about like the core of this movement, like about Draža and his Chetniks. I don't know if Boris or Fritz wants to ask something else that's not connected to that.
I mean, this kind of ties in because I was going to ask about the Ba Congress. So it's something I'm kind of curious about, but don't really know too much about.
Yeah, I mean, we have these questions about the ideology of the Draža movement. So maybe that's also connected to it because I guess Ba was a part of the evolution of their ideology. So as far as I know, a lot of their ideologues came from the pre-war Serbian Cultural Club. So maybe you can talk about that more and this whole idea of homogeneous Serbia and how they thought it could be a part of Yugoslavia. And did it evolve in the end into something else towards the end of the war?
Yeah, so you're completely right in that the Serbian Cultural Club, members of the Serbian Cultural Club come to kind of dominate the political side of Draža's movement. And, I sort of pinpoint three kind of key figures from the Serbian Cultural Club. one of whom is Slobodan Jovanovic, who is the prime minister for a period of Yugoslavia in exile in London. Another figure is Stevan Moljevic from Banja Luka. And the other one then is Dragiša Vasic, who created, along with Slobodan Jovanovic, the Serbian Cultural Club, and several other people created it. And so the Serbian Cultural Club was kind of this group that was really interested in partially exploring Serbian identity and Serbian culture. And they would have these kind of eclectic figures come and give talks and lectures and presentations, and they take people out on these kind of excursions into the countryside and stuff like that. Like field trip, stuff like that. And so in some ways, I think some of the things that kind of get said about them are kind of exaggerated because the group was interested in exploring these kind of avenues, right? And so just because they had someone talking doesn't mean that they necessarily believe in that, you know? So it's kind of difficult in that regard to kind of say, like, because they had so-and-so speaking, they believe this. But at the same time, if you look at their writings, so they had a newspaper called Srpski Glas, right? Serbian Voice. And in this paper, they basically lay out their ideas. And so there tend to be certain features within these newspapers. One kind of feature is what's happening in the war after 1939, because obviously, this is an important feature. How does this war then, how could it impact Yugoslavia, but also within that Serbs within Yugoslavia? Another feature that they have is they do kind of like mini biographies or even long form biographies of the old Chetniks. And actually Ilya Birshanin wrote a few of these articles because, he hung out with these guys and he knew them and was, would write biographies about them and his experiences about, Jovan Babunski, for example, and so has these like biographies in there of these guys. And then some of the other features then that they have is these kind of long, ranging from like really kind of astute political observations to complete kind of like trash rag articles about the kind of agreement that comes about between Yugoslavia and the representatives of Croatia in 1937. And so what happened there is it comes out of what historians call the Croatian question, right? So what is Croatia's place within Yugoslavia? So ethnic Croats kind of see Yugoslavia as slowly becoming Serb dominated, and Croats want a bigger role. And so they negotiate, Vlatko Maček negotiates as the Croatian representative with Yugoslavia, and they create the Maček-Cvetković agreement, and basically create like a large Croatian province out of Yugoslavia. And so the Serbian Cultural Club actually forms around this idea, right? What does it mean for Serbs now that this entity exists? Well, the SKK, Serbian Cultural Club in Serbian, the initials, see it very much as a threat, right? Because now Croatians are going to have too big of a say in this country that we fought for as Serbs, right? Let's not forget that kind of identity, from the interwar period, right? That, it was the Serbs who freed the Croats, and it was the Serbs who united the country, and, all of these elements. And so the SKK really sees this kind of as a threat. And so a lot of the articles then, like I say, they span from really kind of astute political insights to these, completely kind of crazy, the Croats are out and they're going to kill us all kind of thing. And so really that's the kind of core of what the Srpski Glas newspaper becomes, is this kind of exploration then of, what is Serbia's role within Yugoslavia now? How can we as Serbs, as minorities within this Croatian province, how can we create our own identity and protect our own identity and potentially even create our own province, right? Because there's a sizable minority of Serbs within this Croatian Banovina, within this province, right?
Right.
And so, they're kind of worried about this. And so guys like Moljevic, who's a part of this, and guys like Vasic, who's a part of this, they then go on and become kind of key figures in the political side of things for Draža Mihailović, and they bring these ideas with them. And one of the ideas that Moljević brings is his idea of homogeneous Serbia. And basically, this idea is exactly like it sounds, right?
I was about to ask.
It's quite self-explanatory in that regard. It's an ethnically cleansed, which is the term he uses, ethnically cleansed territory of just Serbs. And so he doesn't say how it's going to happen. He just says this is what needs to happen. Right. He very much kind of in his writings operates on those kind of elements. This is what needs to happen, but doesn't kind of tell you how.
Very helpful.
Right. Yeah. And so what he points to then is this creation of a kind of continual Serb territory, which is wherever Serbs live, to create, as I say, this kind of continual territory, which many have since called Greater Serbia. Right. So this tradition then of Greater Serbia kind of goes back to the 19th century, and many see the creation of Yugoslavia as an extension of Greater Serbia and stuff like that. But for Moljević, it's very much an ethnically pure Serbian territory. So not only is it greater, but it's only populated by Serbs.
And so, I take it he thinks of Serbs only as Orthodox, right? He doesn't. What's the relationship to, say, Muslims, Moljević?
Yeah, I'm not sure that he necessarily goes into religion per se, but very much sees Muslims. So, in BCS, Muslimani as a religion is lowercase m, but Muslimani as, a nation or as an ethnic group is a capital M. Right. And the capital M doesn't really get used in Yugoslavia until like the 1960s. And so, you kind of have to keep that in mind. But at the same time, when he refers to the Muslimani, it's always lowercase m. So as a religious group. And so it doesn't really kind of deal with that question of, are we Orthodox? Are we Catholic? It's simply Serb, Croat, Muslim.
So it's open to interpretation, in other words, in some ways.
Yeah, exactly. Again, right? He doesn't say how to do it. Right. So he doesn't worry about definitions. He just worries about what it should be. He's kind of very utopian, I guess you could say. Right. His own conception.
So make it Serb, but I don't know what Serb means, and I don't know how to do that.
Well, he might know. He just chooses not to tell us.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned how he didn't have this. He didn't say how to make it, but it's interesting that there was another member of the Serbian Cultural Club, which was Vaso Čubrilović, who is an interesting character, who was a member of Young Bosnia initially as a kid, and was even later a minister in the socialist government of Yugoslavia, but who in the 30s developed a very detailed program how to ethnically cleanse Kosovo. And I think published it as a suggestion to the government. So maybe they had similar ideas about generally creating homogeneous Serbia, because I guess they were members of the same group.
Exactly. That side of it I haven't really looked into. Only because Čubrilović is his own kind of entity. During the period that I'm looking at. But I think you point to something important there, right? If someone wanted to kind of explore that idea, I think that would be a great kind of comparative kind of aspect, right? These different kind of conceptions then of an ethnically pure Serbia. I think you can then fit in kind of Garašanin from the 19th century. You can fit in the kind of interwar Chetnik associations. You can fit in Čubrilović and Moljević, and keep going all the way up to Šešelj and Mladić, right? And suddenly now you have these nuances then potentially within what is a Greater Serbia? What does that mean? Does that look like over these different periods? Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting because the Serbian Cultural Club, there were some, I don't know much about it, but I saw there were some rumors that they kind of refounded the Black Hand in the 30s, and they had some ex-members of the Black Hand as the members of the organization. And it's kind of interesting because you have someone like Čubrilović there, who is like this kind of left-leaning intellectual, but an extreme nationalist. So these kind of connections exist there, I guess. And one of these people who is a member of it is Dragiša Vasić, that I also wanted to ask you about, who is one of the main founders of the Serbian Cultural Club, but who had his reputation in the 20s and 30s also being a leftist. He was a lawyer who was famous for defending communists in a time when they were very repressed by the state, and but who was a close friend of a leftist, novelist like Miroslav Krleža, for example, a Croat also, and who at some point became one of the ideologues of Serbian nationalism, but who was rumored to be still a kind of a Soviet agent. So I don't know, and this is mentioned often. And I don't know, is it true that when the partisan movement started, the Soviet Union kind of suggested them that they should support the movement of Draža Mihailović? I don't know, this is mentioned sometimes. I don't know if it's actually true. And that this is because they had their guy in there.
Yeah, so that I don't know, only because there is no documentary evidence to suggest that. Mm-hmm. And so, these things, again, we're going back to my Chico Milan at the Serbian Center. Yeah. There, but again, right, there are all these strains of left and right kind of coming together, right? As you mentioned, Vasic, Čubrilović, Đujić, all these guys have some sort of connection at some point, or are at least suspected or rumored to have these kind of connections to the left. And so I'm not sure that kind of talking in left and right, not to kind of suggest the horseshoe theory or anything like that, but I'm not sure that any of those kind of really fit the kind of Balkans in general. So yeah, it's kind of an interesting kind of muddle as all of this is, it seems. So I mean, in terms of the cultural club, the Serbian Cultural Club, that's kind of what I mean, right? Is they kind of entertained all of these ideas. Mm-hmm. You have to remember that the bulk of them are intellectuals, right? They're politicians, they're lawyers, they're doctors, they're university professors, really well-read people. And, they kind of want to think about these things in big picture kind of ways. And so they're going to explore fascism, they're going to explore communism, they're going to explore all of these kind of different ideas that are brand new to them. Again, fascism gets created in 1922. The Russian Revolution happens in 1917. And then you have the constant turmoil in Russia as well with the Civil War and the whites and all that sort of thing happening as well. And let's not forget also, there was briefly a Soviet republic on the border of Yugoslavia for a brief time, but then gets completely crushed, and you have a far right government then, and so there's this mix of all of these kind of ideas happening, and it's very much within that culture that the Serbian Cultural Club exists. Where they are kind of exploring all of these ideas and trying to understand them.
Yeah. When discussing about these labels left and right, I would say that these individuals that we discussed were all nationalists. I think this was a constant in their thought, and even extreme nationalists who didn't have a problem at times using the term, ethnic cleansing in a positive sense, but who at different historical points framed their nationalism in different ways, and sometimes it had more kind of a leftist tone to it, sometimes a more right-wing, but they were always nationalist, and and things like monarchism were not really inherent to their nationalism. So today we have this idea that, the Chetniks were all about the monarchy, but some of the main ideologues were not so much. They were primarily nationalist, not monarchist.
Exactly. And, there are kind of two things that I kind of wanted to add to what you said there. One is that, let's also not forget that this is the kind of time period in which, I hate the term, but, you have to kind of use it. But, ethnic cleansing was actually allowed to happen at an international level. Yeah. Right. Between Greece and Turkey. Yeah. It was actually a law that, transferred populations from, Muslim populations from Greece to Turkey, and Orthodox populations from Turkey to Greece, regardless of what language they
spoke. Thus solving all their problems forever.
Exactly. Yes. And peace ever after, right?
Never a conflict since.
Nope. Never. Especially not between those two.
Famous friends.
And so, so again, to kind of like, this isn't, I guess what I'm trying to say is it's not just a Balkan phenomenon.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
It isn't just happening in Yugoslavia. It's not just happening in Greece. The United States is looking at this stuff and going, you know what, that sounds really cool.
Yeah.
I like that idea. And poof, we have Woodrow Wilson
Yeah.
coming up.
And the largest example of that would be, in South Asia, right? In India and Pakistan, population transfers, millions of people in 7. So, yeah, I mean, it was very much a normal thing at the time.
Exactly.
An accepted thing, yeah.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
So you have that kind of strain of it, right? Where all of these things are kind of allowed to happen. And so, to kind of even say then that to even say that something like nationalism is an exclusively right-wing kind of phenomenon is incorrect.
No, definitely.
As you say, the Balkans kind of point to that fact.
Yeah. I don't know, could we maybe briefly just talk about the history of Draža's collaboration and how it evolved? Like, from my understanding, after initial period of collaboration with the partisans, even in the end of the 41, he approached the Germans and offered them some kind of a deal and was refused. And in 42, he's mostly in Montenegro, and in 43, they make some kind of a secret deal with the Germans. And in 44, it's more or less open collaboration. This is after the Allies started favoring the partisans, and even the king himself, the exiled king, had this call over Radio London and encouraged Chetniks to join the partisans. So after that, the ones who didn't join the partisans remained with Draža and were open collaborators, as far as I understand, but still with the hopes of somehow being accepted by the Western Allies in the end of the war.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that collaboration, so I think that the presence of the partisans and the kind of communist element really kind of forced Draža into collaborating with the Germans, this is, as well as allowing, kind of okaying reluctantly the collaboration with Italy. And so, throughout 1941, he wants to kind of try and create a unified resistance against the Germans, but can't find, depending on which side you believe, can't find kind of common ground with the communists. The communists want him to kind of come under their umbrella, and he wants them to come under his umbrella. Now, I mean, regardless of what your politics are, of what one's politics are, we have to understand that Draža is coming at this from the perspective of an officer and as a representative of the king and the government. And the king and the government have said all resistance movements need to become part of Mihailovich's movement. And so when he goes, so the first couple kind of meetings between the Chetniks and the partisans don't really have this element, but later on, I think it's by November or December 1941, they have that element where Draža is now a representative of the government. Not officially, but the government has said, if you're going to resist, you're fighting under Mihailovich. And so he goes to the partisans and says, so come on, you're resisting, you're going to fight under me. And the partisans say, no, we're not, because we have our own motivations and we have our own goals. You're going to fight under us. And so, I guess a case could be made that a deal could have been struck between the two groups prior to that. Certainly there wasn't any lost feelings by the time Draža becomes a representative. But at the same time, he at least has that behind him by those kind of last couple of negotiations. And then, of course, all hell breaks loose between the Chetniks and partisans, and we have a civil war on top of this other war that's happening. And so the presence then of the partisans as another element kind of throws a wrench into Draža's works, where he can't resist the Germans openly anymore. Partially because he doesn't want the reprisals, partially because the communists are going out and actually resisting and actually conducting a guerrilla warfare and actually attacking Germans. And the Germans then are turning around and wiping out entire villages, like Kragujevac, for example, and Kraljevo, and actually taking out reprisals on Serbian civilians. And so Draža sees this and kind of shuts down and basically sends his guys off everywhere else except for I think it's like 4 or 5 people around him. in which case then, his guys kind of infiltrate Nedic's group, and they infiltrate Ljotic, and they infiltrate even like, the Germans, for example, and the communists, and stuff like that. And so I think Draža's kind of idea was to resist eventually, right? He sort of maintains that throughout. We're going to resist, and we will call a general uprising, but only when the Allies can land here. Right.
There's
and
this
so
word in I don't know who says it, but maybe you all know. But Javasluk, is that a Bosnian word?
Javasluk?
Yeah, like tomorrow,
Everyone
kind
says
of.
that in
It'll never
Yugoslavia.
come. Okay, yeah, that's it. He'll resist Javasluk. It'll tomorrow's tomorrow.
Exactly. Eventually. Yeah. Exactly. And so I think his motivation in that regard was generally sincere. And so his plan then is to kind of send his guys away, which he does, and to infiltrate all of these kind of groups and these organizations like Ljotic, for example. And his thinking, at least, is that when I give the word, they're going to turn, my guys in these different groups are going to turn on the people that they've been working with for all of these years or months or whatever, and take over, and they're going to resist. And then the people will see this and they'll resist. And, he really has these kind of grand schemes. But what he doesn't realize is that just quite how big of an idea this is, how unrealistic it is. And so, his guys, a lot of them, they end up staying where they are, and actually becoming communists, for example, or actually escaping to North America as Ljotic people, and stuff like that. So his plan ultimately fails, and so the kind of communists push him, I think, a little bit to actual collaboration. And so by the time you get to like 1942, 1943. Certainly in 1942, he sees what's happening in Montenegro and sees them actually openly collaborating, and doesn't agree with it because of what they're doing and how they're doing it, but has no choice but to accept it because it seems to be working, right? His main goal by 1942 is to save Serb lives, and collaborating with Italy and Montenegro and collaborating with Italy and Dalmatia is saving Serbian lives. So he can't say anything about it in that regard. But also it's already happening. So what's he going to do? His hands are tied by that point. And so I think in some ways, he has no choice but to collaborate. But then in other ways, I think the pressure that the communists presented by 1943, and certainly by 1944, as you say, when he officially loses support from the Allies, all bets are off. They're basically wiped out. The Chetniks have no other option. And so collaboration with the Germans becomes increasingly open. So even, these kind of informal agreements, the kind of handshake agreements and oral agreements, become written, not by Mihailovich, mind you. He, to my knowledge, he never signed any documents with the Germans, but his officers certainly do. And he gave them power of attorney to do such things. So, you have like Dungic, for example, like actually signing documents with the Germans. And actually, he's like his number 3 officer or something like that in the rank. So, certainly it's okayed by him.
Right.
And so, he was very smart in that regard, if nothing else, to kind of keep himself distanced as much as possible. But the problem is that he didn't distance himself enough, right? It becomes very obvious, right? And so it's slightly more obvious in that regard in terms of collaboration. And my argument is then to show that, it's far more obvious that he also had this genocidal plan as well. And has these agreements then with Jurisic, for example. Right?
But yeah, if he's like this kind of a legalist officer, like the same argument that he used for the partisans in 41 can be used against him in 44 when, the king and the exile government say, well, okay, now the legal resistance is the one led by Tito. So basically, his own arguments are now used against him, right?
Exactly. And they do get used against him. And, rightfully so.
Yeah.
I think if you want me to take a position, not that you're pushing me into a position. Doesn't take
Do
much
it,
pushing.
Stevan. Line in the sand.
Right? Yes. Mark it with my own blood.
Yes,
in the sand.
exactly.
You know, but at the same time, you know, he had a point in 1941. You know, so you know, it kind of cuts both ways there. I think in a lot of ways. You know, when he talks about the communists being traitors, you know, they were, and you know, quite readily, a lot of them said, "Yeah, we are." You know, so you know, we're fighting against the bourgeois establishment.
Yeah, that's the whole point. Yeah,
exactly. And so, you know, by 1944, the only difference is that the Raja claims that he's not a traitor. You know, that the king, the terms that they use in the documents is that the king is captive. You know, so you know that kind of has all these different kind of sentiments and meanings. But basically, what he means is very much in the terms of you know, he's being influenced. You know, the British are whispering in his ear and telling him what to do. And so this is the Chetnik argument, whether I agree.
Meanwhile, the Germans and Ustasha are literally working with his comrades to tell them what to do.
Exactly. Yeah. Actually uniforming them, right? Dressing them, and you know, giving them boots. Exactly. Yeah. So you know, it is this kind of muddled kind of situation. And so you know,
you can say the word clusterfuck here. You know, you can.
I've also got kids in the next room, so I've also got my dad hat on at the same time. So yeah,
it's a clusterfudge.
There you go. Again, your words, not mine.
I also wanted to ask two questions about those Chetniks that are joining the partisans, but like it's two different questions in two different periods. So one is like the ones who join in 41 and 42. So we have like a person like Vlado Zečević, another priest, Chetnik, who does a different thing. He joins the partisans and becomes one of the leaders, even like political leaders of the partisans, and has high positions after the war in the government. But I was also kind of surprised to learn that there was even a term used by the partisans early on in 42, I think, which was volunteer detachments. In the whole army, the partisan movement at some point was called the National Liberation Army of Yugoslavia and volunteer detachments. And what the volunteer detachments meant, it was a term used to designate those Chetniks who agreed to be under partisan command. So I don't know if you can say anything about that.
Yeah, so certainly in the early days in 41 and 42, again, you have to kind of think of the context with what's going on, right? And so, for example, in a lot of parts, like in Bosanska Krajina, for example, when they're uprising against when the Serbs at least are uprising against the Ustasha, you know, the communists try to take control of it. The officers also try to take control of it. And so you have people fighting alongside one another, and you know, one person will have like the Kokarda from the Yugoslav army, and then the next person will have like Red Star on them, right? For example. And so the ideologies weren't quite as cut and dry as they become over time. And so, you know, even in Dalmatia, you have that where, you know, in those refugee camps I mentioned, where they sort of threw the officers in and the refugees and the, you know, everyone who's kind of fleeing, you know, you have communist propaganda kind of infiltrating the camps, and that takes, you know, the vast majority of the people. But you still have the kind of nationalist bent of people who are, you know, arguing for the king even still, or, you know, Serb nationalism. And so you have, again, this kind of mixture then of people who are trying to figure out, you know, what does this side mean? Well, first of all, are there any sides, right? You know, are we a kind of uniform contingent who are fighting for the same goal? And then eventually, you know, what does one side represent? What does the other side represent? And then ultimately, what do I believe? And, you know, I mean, I think these are questions that we all struggle with at one point in our lives, at least one point, most of us probably throughout our lives. But, you know, I don't think you would find anyone who kind of falls very neatly within any one kind of ideology. You know, the easiest, I think, is to kind of compare it to like political parties. political parties say, we stand for A, B, and C, and people might vote for that party, but not necessarily agree with, point F, for example, right? And yet they'll still vote for them. And so you have these kind of ideas then of people aligning themselves with things that maybe they don't necessarily agree with, but that they agree with more than the other side. And so I think a lot of 1941 and 1942 is that, right? Most of the kind of division that kind of gets mentioned even in the memoirs as well as in the secondary literature is the people saying, you know what, I didn't agree with the way that Draža was conducting or not conducting the resistance, and I wanted to fight, so I joined the partisans, or the communists at that point, the partisans yet. Whereas later on, those volunteer detachments, then that comes more out of the partisans actually saying, you know what, we're offering amnesty to the people who want to come and fight with us. You may have previously fought against us, but at this point, we're going to allow you free reign to come and join us.
So the amnesty, it comes in 44 and 45, right?
They kind of issue that's the official kind of amnesty. I think there were two kind of official ones that the communists issued. But throughout the war, both the Chetniks and the partisans continually appealed to people, and they'd say, you're fighting for the wrong cause. They don't care about the peasants, and both sides would use the exact same rhetoric.
Right. Nobody cares about the peasants.
Exactly. No one cares about the peasants. No one cares about the workers. No one, all that they have is their self-interest. So-and-so is being paid by the Nazis, stuff like that. Right. So throughout they kind of have these things. Whereas the partisans kind of have, I think it's two official kind of amnesty agreements. There's one in 44 and then I think one in 45. And at which point they say, like, if you don't join us now, we're coming after you, basically. They don't quite.
So these are the amnesties that come after the Allies support the partisans as the official army, and the king also had his call toward Chetniks to join the partisans. So, and now this is the other question about this that I want to ask you. So I found in a book by the historian Milan Radanović that he published a few years ago, he claims there that more than a half of Chetniks in Serbia after these amnesties joined partisans, which is, I think, really a very important information that's kind of not really mentioned by anyone. There, like the Titoist history kind of overlooked that. It was the data was there, but it really wasn't pointed out. And also the kind of pro-Chetnik and now revisionist historians really kind of overlooked that. And I think that fact that so many Chetniks joined the partisans in the end of the war kind of goes against both narratives, the ideological ones, I would say, and probably is the reason why it's overlooked so much.
Exactly. I mean, part of the reason why it got overlooked so much too is because, if you have so many people who fought for the other side, and suddenly you call them out, well, you don't have a state anymore. You're suddenly not in charge. So, that's part of it. And I think Max Bergholz does a good job of showing that in his book, Violence as a Generative Force, is his book. He shows that, a number of people, as I said previously, they really didn't understand either one of these ideologies. They didn't care. They didn't know. All that they knew was that their lives were threatened. And so they're going to fight with the side that they think makes the most sense. Whether it's openly fighting or whether it's laying in wait, they're going to join that side and stick with that side. Now, of course, that kind of changes things later on in the war with things like the amnesty, with things like, even after the amnesty, people kind of going and joining anyway, or, picking up the red star and sewing it onto their caps instead of the kokarda or something. And so you have these kind of contexts in which people have to kind of make decisions, not just on the personal level, but on the kind of political levels as well. And does it make sense then for us to kind of pursue these ideas? Does it make sense for us to call out these people for not being, to use the communist term, ideologically pure? Do we need to kind of go after them, or does it make more sense for us to just kind of, let things sleep a little bit and not mention it because it'll threaten us as well? And so, there very much is, that very much is, I think, an indictment on both sides. It shows that no matter how pure, quote unquote, one's ideology might be, there are always going to be people who interpret those ideologies in their own way. There are always going to be people who ignore those ideologies and do what's best for them. There's always going to be a contingent who agrees but doesn't join, right? Because, again, another million different reasons. It's too difficult to make that leap, or whatever. And so, you do have all these kind of issues, and you're absolutely right. It does, come down to kind of being an indictment on both sides in that regard, where you do have people, at least on kind of local government levels, who were Chetnik, and very vocally so, going into the later 1940s and 1950s, and suddenly they're the staunchest communists.
Yeah.
And then it kind of makes the 90s make a bit more sense in that regard too, then, where you have communists who are suddenly now extreme nationalists. So.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, overnight.
I think that this theme was kind of overlooked, because this question of Chetniks joining the partisans on a mass scale it really it strikes the legitimacy of both movements in some way, I would say, because for the Chetniks, if their king asked them to join the partisans, and then the majority of them did, it kind of the whole reason of their existence is kind of, it doesn't, they don't have it anymore. I mean, the question of the Chetnik movement is resolved, really. They were asked to join the partisans, and they did. And on the other hand, for the communist side, the side of the Communist Party of Yugoslavia, it's also kind of, I guess, an embarrassment, because as we said in a previous episode about Chetniks, the most of the pre-war members of the Communist Party died during the war, and it was not such a massive party. It had probably 12,000 members, out of which 9,000 died during the war. And after the war, the Communist Party has 400,000 members. So these are all partisans, and many of them were Chetniks. So not only did these people join the partisans, but they joined the social group out of which the privileged class of the Yugoslav system was recruited from. So a lot of Chetniks kind of enjoyed the privileges of being a part of what was later called the red bourgeoisie, the new ruling class, let's say. So I don't know. It's interesting to me, this question.
No, you're absolutely right. I think it's a super interesting and super important question, I think, to ask. I've got a really great document that I found. So in Zagreb is where I got the majority of my documentation on the Dinara division. They call it the Dinara Chetnički Oblast. That's what they call it there in the Fonds. And it's a report, I think it's from Lika. And one of the commanders is writing to his superior officer, and it's just a regular report, nothing fancy about it. We did this and this happened and then that happened, and Pero lost his opanak or something, and we need more leather for more opansi. But then towards the end of the document, he mentions, last night we were listening to the radio and we heard someone who called himself King Peter telling us to go and join the partisan. And we just spent 4 years of our lives fighting these people on his behalf.
Yeah.
How do I respond to my officers now, or to my soldiers now, who are asking, what do we do? What am I supposed to do? I just spent 4 years of my life fighting against these people on this guy's behalf, who's sitting comfortably in London, mind you. What do I do? Please advise. Now, unfortunately, I don't have the response that he got. So we kind of have to speculate. But I mean, Ray, as you say, there's 400,000 members by the end of the war, was it, you said, I think.
Yeah.
And my God, like, how many of those then must have been in this guy's Opanke? Right? Trying to figure out what the hell do we do. And you better believe a bunch of them went over, as they say. A bunch of them left, right? They buggered off to Italy and Germany, and if anything at all, like my dad, helped build some of the buildings in West Germany, before settling in England and then here in Canada. And so you have this kind of mix then of people trying to figure out exactly what do we do, and so it's between 1941 and 1945 especially, probably especially like the 41 to 43 44 window, you have people wondering, what do we do?
No.
What do I believe in? What side do I belong to, if I belong to any side? And then the king then comes and says this, and again, my entire existence for the last several years is completely thrown for a loop. And do I even believe that this is the king? Is this propaganda? So yeah, I think it's a really great document, and I think it really points to the kind of, like, as you read it, you really kind of get the sense of, like, again, kids in the next room, WTF?
Yeah.
What is it that I do about this?
Yeah.
And as you say, a bunch of them join, and kind of muddies then the kind of post-war communist ideology or the narratives.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, we've kept you a long time. I just realized we've been on for 2 hours. So.
Yeah, I'm not sure what you expected there when you came into the compound, but I guess you've worked hard enough. You get your passport back. We'll open the doors.
I'm getting paid for this, right?
Yeah, we'll get that right to you. Yavashlu.
But thanks a lot for coming on. That was great.
Yeah, it was really great.
It's a lot of info.
Yes, it's dense, isn't it? No, I thank you guys. Like, this is a great experience, and I had a lot of fun. Anytime I get to kind of nerd out and talk with a bunch of other nerds about stuff like this.
That's us.
That's this show. That is the show.
It's always a good time, so I appreciate it.
Well, tell your nerd friends.
For sure. Oh, you better believe it.
All right, thanks, Stevan.
Hi, man. Good talking to you.
Fantastic.
Yeah, good talking to you guys.
Fritz here from The Empire Never Ended. This has been one of our weekly free episodes for free people. But for premium people, we also have weekly premium episodes, which you can get at patreon.com/tenepod, TENEPOD, and also follow our various social media things in the show description there. Like and subscribe them. Follow them. Like and follow and subscribe. Follow them. Do it.